everyone, welcome to the new video. So today we will see some real-time interview question asked for DevSecOps role. So without further ado, let's go. So first question is, what is the difference between Azure RBAC, AWS IAM and Kubernetes RBAC? So before I'll start with the question and answer, but before this I will tell you that all the questions were around like how to control the access of the users and how to secure the access. So uh, basically they were looking for Azure DevOps, but if you are good in AWS and all, I have mixed both of them, both the cloud. So basically, what is the difference between RBAC IAM and Kubernetes RBAC? So Azure RBAC control access to Azure cloud resources. So suppose there will be subscription, under subscription there will be resource group, and under resource group there will be the resources of that particular cluster and everything. So to control the access on that level, we have Azure RBAC. Again, for AWS IAM, again it is for controlling the access on AWS level like EC2, S3, EKS. Kubernetes RBAC control permission inside the Kubernetes cluster, like the resources of Kubernetes like namespaces, pods, deployment, secret. So cloud RBAC secure infrastructure level access, while Kubernetes RBAC secure workload level access inside the cluster. Why we need cloud level RBAC and Kubernetes RBAC both? Because we need to secure at different layers. So cloud RBACs such as Azure RBAC or AWS IAM control access to cloud infrastructure resources. Okay, then Kubernetes RBAC controls what we can do inside the cluster, such as accessing namespace, pod, deployment secret. Using both together provide layered security, least privilege access, and namespace isolation and better governance in enterprise environments. Now, how will you ensure least privilege access to users? To ensure least privilege access, I would implement RBAC using Azure RBAC, AWS IAM role. So, RBAC is role-based access control. So instead of granting access to each and every user, we'll create roles, we'll create groups. So for like there will be a developer group, and on that developer group we'll assign the developer role, and in that developer group we'll add all the developers. So that is one best thing, access limiting the access to role based access control instead of managing access for each individual. That becomes very difficult. So that's why, to ensure least privilege, I would implement RBAC using Azure RBAC, AWS IAM or Kubernetes RBAC. So you don't have to manage, or you avoid the mistakes. User only would receive only minimum required permission based on their role and namespace. So I would avoid cluster admin access or use temporary elevated access through JIT, just in time access. For some time you give the access and then remove it. Separate environments, use groups instead of direct permissions. As I said, regularly review access and immediately revoke permission during offboarding or team changes. Then the next question is, how will you do user audit and logging? So I would implement centralized audit logging across Azure, AWS, Kubernetes environment. In Azure, I would use Azure Activity Log, Azure Monitor, Sentinel. In AWS, I would use CloudTrail, CloudWatch, and Guard Duty. For Kubernetes, I would enable API server audit logs to track user activities like pod deletions, secret tags, and RBAC changes. And all logs would be centralized into a SIEM platform such as Sentinel, Splunk, or ELK stack for monitoring, alerting, compliance, and forensic analysis. You can also add on, like I can start doing an automation. If you talk about automation, they can ask that at what type of automation you'll do, what programming language, what shell scripting will you use, where you learn it, or where will you run it, what all commands will you use. So if you don't remember the command, just talk about what Azure CLI commands, or you'll use AWS CLI commands, or you'll use shell scripting. So how will you connect to the portal? How will you get the list? You talk about that. Now, how will you ensure access removal if developer moves from one team to another? So, I would implement centralized identity and access management using Intra ID or AWS IAM Identity Center. So access would never be assigned directly to user. When a developer moves from one team to another team, I would remove the user from the group and add them to a new team group, which automatically update Azure RBAC, AWS IAM, and Kubernetes role binding. I would also enforce namespace isolation, automate the process, and validate access removal through audit logging and periodic access reviews. Now the next question is, how will you ensure cluster plane isolation? To ensure cluster plane isolation, I would separate dev, QA and production into different Kubernetes cluster and use managed services like EKS or EKS to secure the control plane. I would implement namespace isolation, RBAC network policy, node isolation and pod security standards to restrict lateral movement between teams and workloads. API server access would be restricted through private networking or VPN, and audit logging would be enabled for monitoring. Then they can ask like, how will you do the CI/CD pipeline for different environments? What kind of configuration will you do? You can talk about Helm, or you can talk about kubectl and how you are managing it for different environment. Then you can talk about how you are having the versioning enabled in your Helm, so that you can roll back easily or for the tracking purpose. So talk about it. And for reference, I am giving like this, how we create roles in Kubernetes. So we created by RBAC authorization, we give the namespace name, and then we give the API groups resources and what on what resources, in this namespace, on what resources they can do, like they can get, list and watch. So this is a Kubernetes RBAC. So like this, there will be a cluster role binding in the cluster, on the cluster level, and the user can perform these type of verbs on the namespace and on the namespace QA. Okay, then we have like Azure RBAC is like this, like we do authentication using AD, and then there will be Azure RBAC authorization. First we can log in, and then what all we can perform, are we authorized for that Kubernetes cluster, and what all we are authorized to do inside that Kubernetes cluster is controlled by Kubernetes RBAC. So firstly we are able to log in on Azure portal, and then when our user ID is created, that is checked in AD. Then can we access particular resource, that we can check in Azure RBAC, and what we can perform and that on that service of Azure platform, the Azure service resource, that we can check using Kubernetes RBAC. Similarly, we have it for AWS. Like we can, the access and all is managed using AWS Identity Access Management. We can use AWS Lambda also for automation of creation, updation, or deletion of the IAM user, our group. And then on that level, after that Kubernetes, like all these things are controlled under Kubernetes. So I hope things are clear on this part, and if any such questions you come across, you are able to answer. So yeah, that's all. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know in the comment section. Till then, take care. Bye.